Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. This evening, I have someone really special with me, Professor Dipankar Sengupta, who's a professor in the University of Jammu. I've had the pleasure of listening to him on various different subjects, including internal and external politics, with regards on various, on a particular platform. And I found his views to be insightful, especially with regards to India and its outlook abroad. Of course, he has a keen eye on economy and various other things around the country, and I must tell you, very well read, and that's something I can make out by the way he speaks. Sir, good evening, and thank you so much for joining me. I hope to have a long interaction with you and learn most importantly.
Thank you, Adi, for having me on this show. Pleasure to be on a new platform like this, especially which has a varied audience of this particular kind and clearly a very discerning audience of this kind.
Thank you so much, sir. So, my first question to you, and let's keep it a little easy at the beginning and a little broad perspective. If there is a point of time in the past, let's say 2 decades, where you could say India has started moving faster, a lot of people would attribute that to the advent of Prime Minister Modi in 2014. I'd like to leave that apart and say, what is a geopolitical situation that you found India in, wherein you said, okay, now's the time India has really started rising?
Uh, Adi, first let's start with economics. We can
So,
start with Modi later on and the geopolitics later on. Look, economic theory tells us there's this theory called the theory of convergence, which says that over time, the slower going economies, the low income economies start to grow fast, and the high income, mature income economies, they basically their growth slows down. Now, if you look at the economies of the world, functioning economies of the world, let's not talk about sub-Saharan Africa or the Latin American basket cases. You can see that happening. For example, if you look at Europe, United States, their growth rates are modest, their per capita incomes are extremely high. On the other hand, you have countries like China, you have countries like India, etc., whose per capita incomes are low, China higher than India's, but our growth rates are high. So, in any sense, whatever would have happened is without Modi, this process of catching on would have continued. But as I said, this catching on is not necessarily assured. It's a natural tendency, it's not necessarily assured. Otherwise, poorer African economies would have grown faster. So it's extremely important to have the necessary institutions that support this particular growth. You have to have free markets, you have to have a government policy, you have to have courts, a legal structure that supports all this. Now let's get back to 2014. In 2014, in the run up from 2004 to 2014, and this is important, we were in the country was in the middle of a policy sclerosis. There was a policy paralysis. The country was just not moving. It's very well for critics of this government to point out to that area and say, look, growth rates were very, very high. Actually, the foundation for those particular growth rates, I would argue, were laid before that. The golden quadrilateral that Atal Bihari Vajpayee started was at least in part responsible for this. Secondly, you had very irresponsible banking policies which gave credit to left, right, and center. The problem that this government was confronted with, the twin balance sheet problem, was that actually you gave credit to a lot of people who borrowed, invested, they grew. So you had countries, this Bhushan Steel. Nobody had heard of Bhushan Steel before 2004. They borrowed, they set up this steel plant, and after some time that became a non-performing asset. Now 2004 and 2014 also marked the time where companies like Tata, instead of expanding their domestic steel production, started to acquire assets abroad. Why? Why weren't you putting steel factories in India? Because doing business in India in that 10 years had become extremely difficult. If you look at the ease of doing business of the World Bank, there has been a dramatic change from 2014 onwards. We've done very, very well. We need to do much, much more. So, number of things. One, natural economic processes. The second one, the removal of the policy sclerosis that we saw. The banks have cleaned up their balance sheets. They are in a position to lend money. And geopolitically, of course, we are far more confident. We are basically striking trade deals one after the other. Doing an FTA in India in the past was a nightmare. We would argue on so many things that never got signed. Now we've arrived at a number of FTAs, one with the United Arab Emirates, one with Australia. The fact that they got signed is actually a big thing. This is a country that basically, is giving the impression that it means business. Look, and it's not happened for a long period of time. Uh, Macroeconomically, the government has tried to be very, very disciplined, but it has not got the necessary support from some of the domestic institutions. And if you ask me which of those institutions, I'll be happy to tell you which ones.
Please, sir.
Okay, if you look at our macroeconomic policies, the government from 2014 all the way till 2019 tried to cut down its fiscal deficit. We tried to live within our means. Now, what happens is when you start cutting down your deficit, you expect the central bank to reciprocate by cutting down interest rates.
So that, yeah.
So, see, there are two ways to stoke the economy. One is to raise government expenditure. What that does is to raise interest rates, and it crowds out private investment. This government tried to live within its means and thought that the Reserve Bank of India would lower its interest rates and that would promote private investment. But for 6 long years, that did not happen because of the cussed nature of certain Reserve Bank governors who ensured that rate cuts were far less than what was required. Real interest rates in that particular period, from 2014 to 2019, rose phenomenally. With those kind of real interest rates, it's very difficult to invest. So when people say, why did India slow down? That was the elephant in the room. People talked about demonetization, 1001 things. No, real interest rates was rising very, very fast from 2014 to 2019. And I lay that at the door of the central bank. Today, of course, the central bank has become far more dynamic, far more proactive. Ironically, it has happened at a time when the stewardship of the Reserve Bank is not with an economist, but is with a civil servant who does not have a degree in economics. So it shows that central banking needs more common sense than the knowledge of economics.
It is, and that actually brings us to a very, see, this answer that you gave us a very interesting baseline for the internal factor of India with regards to its geopolitical position. At the end of it, geopolitics is all defined by economy. You
Right?
can be a strong country, as Pakistan calls itself, but it has no economy. So geopolitically, it's particularly weak. Today, how do you see the stand of India with regards global geopolitics is concerned, and regional? Today, I guess India is, I think, climbed over that particular ladder, but I'd expect
Yes.
your comments on that as well.
Yes. Look.
Global
Nobody,
geopolitics,
nobody
where do we stand?
equates India. Nobody equates India with Pakistan any longer. That
Any
equivalence
longer?
has long been broken. Okay. Now the question is the following: when it comes to China, there is no doubt that China, compared to India, is an economic giant. But where India scores over China is the fact that China is fast turning into a mercantilist power. That means it exports in such a manner that it exports to hurt others. If your exports were matched by your imports, nobody would complain. But that's not what China does. China will export, but it will ensure it does not import. Let me give you an example. Vis-a-vis India, okay, China is obviously a low-cost economy, a more competitive economy where India is concerned, and as a result of which it will have a trade surplus. But there are areas, for example, pharmaceuticals, especially cancer drugs, etc., where India has an advantage. Does China allow Chinese to import Indian drugs?
Nope.
They do not. Ironically, there is a Chinese film, about a family which is fighting cancer, and it is a happy ending because they are able to get drugs illegally from India. I forget the name of the film. And yet you have the Chinese authorities foolishly ensuring that Chinese India is not able to export goods to China. By the way, how much pharmaceuticals could you export anyway? They have a 90 billion to $100 billion trade surplus with us. It won't hurt them. It's this mercantilist policy that they've ingrained, that they practice with the rest of the world and India, which is ensuring that the Chinese clout in the rest of the world is not commensurate with its economic clout. Because whatever they do now, they are seen as an economy which basically sucks the lifeblood of the country where they invest. For example, after the initial enthusiasm, euphoria about this, Belt and Roads initiative, that's gone out. Okay. So Belt and Roads, unfortunately, was not an initiative to improve connectivity. It was ultimately an exercise to ensure that Chinese excess capacity could be fully utilized by exporting to the rest of the world. You would install roads, railways, etc., and saddle them with debt. That was the problem. Those countries which are recipients of this particular so-called largesse are now figuring out that this is not a gift, it's a millstone around their neck. And that is why the Chinese, in a sense, have blotted their copybooks. People will not openly talk against China, but what it has done, it has raised India's profile, because India is not seen to be a predatory economic power. Now, that's one part. What's the positive part? The positive part is India has always believed in multilateralism. You know, in spite of being hurt ourselves, we talk about setting up a system which is primarily rules based and everybody plays by the rules. Number one. Number two, yes, given the fact that we are at a certain stage of our development, we need certain concessions vis-a-vis health and so on and so forth. And that strikes a resonance, that is a resonance with a lot of the global south. So when we are saying, look, you can't be that gung-ho on intellectual property rights where medicine is concerned, that strikes a chord in many poor countries, because, even if you get a small disease like diarrhea, an illness like diarrhea in an African country, given the price of anti-diarrheal drugs, you could actually die.
Yeah.
So these things become extremely important, and the fact that India basically speaks for it gives India a lot of salience in these particular countries. And of course, let's not be also be realistic about it. We are also seen as a country that can be played off against China. Okay, and there is a lot of dishonesty in this, that
Yes.
European countries trade with China. They give concessions to China. Their businessmen basically invest in China, procure in China what they could have procured in India, yet choose not to do so. And yet, Western politicians expect that when, push comes to shove, India can be put forward to do the shoving. And
Exactly.
luckily, India has not fallen for it. You see, even when we are part of the Quad, we make it a point to tell the rest of the world that the Quad is not anti anybody, that it has a multi-pronged agenda. Very clever of us.
Indeed. I mean, I must say, sir, I wanted to ask you another question, but when you rounded this up, one point that you made, I must say, has not been condoned by a lot of people around the world. And I listen to a lot of China dialogues. I think my channel is predominantly about China. You said that China builds up its exports and ensures that it has a profitable or a favorable trade balance against any country, and it does not let you export to it.
Yes.
So that tells you that this is a predatory practice to begin with. Chinese trade itself is predatory in nature. So they're not trading to do business. They are trading to actually build a certain geopolitical edge over you. And that is a
No.
very interesting point.
Okay. I believe China's predatory trade practices stem from an internal contradiction. You see, why doesn't China import more? Because unlike Japan in the 1950s and 60s, which saw income doubling policies, so you increased domestic income, you increased domestic disposable income, as a result of which domestic audiences or domestic population consumed more, and more
Yep.
you consume, the more you import. China actually has not done that. China has, it calls itself a communist country, but if you look at income inequality has China has worsened, and they have basically let it worsen. So there may or may not be an iron rice bowl which guarantees a minimum to everybody, but the so income doubling plans which you expected to see after some time, in a sense, have not occurred. Now, given the fact that they need to stoke domestic demand, you could stoke domestic demand by income transfer policies or by government expenditures that basically boost infrastructure. Now, given a level of economic activity, how much infrastructure can you have? Number one. So what do? You try to push your exports. And until the Chinese sort that domestic problem out, start transferring incomes to their own citizenry, enabling them to purchase more, buy more, you're going to have this particular problem. They will require a vent for surplus, the rest of to stoke domestic demand, and they will keep on exporting to the rest of the world. They will, this is basically called beggar thy neighbor, and they will continue with these beggar thy neighbors because they cannot solve this domestic problem on their own.
So, although this discussion is about India, but I'd like to ask you a follow up on this because, as an economist, I think you'll be able to give a very precise answer. You're talking about increasing the salaries of Chinese people so that they could spend more
Not,
within China.
not salary. You see, the question is the following: not just salaries. It's basically an income transfer plan. See,
Absolutely.
what has happened is, in the West, what happened? You had powerful trade unions, which
Hmm.
Galbraith used to call, countervailing power.
Hmm.
These trade unions pushed up wages. And when they pushed up wages, domestic demand also rose. It also forced the West to vacate low technology goods and go on to higher technology goods.
Indeed.
Okay. And now the question where the Chinese is concerned, I thought it would have happened naturally because their labor supplies are shrinking. Because of the one child
Child
policy
policy.
norm, the number of people retiring is much, much more than the number of people entering the labor force. I had expected their wages to rise. Those wages have risen, but not by much. Not by much. These wages will have to rise very, very fast. You see, now, true, if the wages rise, the Chinese will have to vacate the low technology areas pretty fast, which in any case are now being slowly but surely taken over by Bangladesh and Vietnam.
Yes.
Okay. But the climb up the technology ladder, in a sense, for China, I don't think has been as fast as it should be. How the Chinese solve that particular problem, I don't know. The Chinese haven't solved it yet.
As a matter of fact, as you give more money to people, your cost of labor goes up, which takes the
True.
entire Chinese advantage out the window.
Yes and no. This would have been 20 years ago. But then
So,
today, the question is the following here. You cannot keep exporting the same low technology stuff year after year after year.
yeah,
You have to climb the technology ladder.
I,
And when you climb the technology ladder, you
yeah.
get better prices for your products. You are able to pay labor more. When will China start doing that? And secondly, the other thing the Chinese could do is basically transfer income. You basically give income, dole out income, basic minimum income, whatever. The Chinese, in a sense, have not done that. So, how do you increase the disposable income of your people so that instead of being forced to export, you have a domestic consumption that basically ensures that you have a high growth rate? The Chinese aren't doing that.
I'd love to have this China conversation over a separate episode with you, sir, because
Sure,
this is
absolutely.
intriguing. I personally argue that China is not beyond $7 to $8 trillion, and I'd love to have this discussion with you at some point of time, sir. But anyways, you'd like to comment on it.
Look,
My
a lot
audience
of
is very,
people,
very crazy about China, so please, that's not a
a
problem.
lot of a lot of people raise doubts about Chinese figures.
Sir,
But you see, if you extrapolate Chinese GDP figures from its trade figures, and where trade figures are concerned, whatever China claims to be trading, in a sense, is independently verified by its trading partner. So
Mhm.
you add up our imports from China, they should equal China's exports. So to that extent, talk about China's GDP being overtly inflated may not be correct. There would be a degree of inflation, no doubt about it, but
Mhm.
there are limits to how much China can also inflate
Inflate.
its own GDP figures. Yes.
Fantastic. We'll learn about that, sir. Sir,
Okay.
the global south, and
Right.
this is an interesting development that happened as far as India is concerned. I believe it raised a lot of eyebrows in the West because the call for Ukraine in the United Nations got 113 or 120 votes. The call by India for a meeting for Global South got 123 countries. And
Hmm.
that's interesting. That's the United Nations, and this is a single country, India, which is calling people to for it to become the voice of Global South, not even the leader.
Right. Right.
What is the thought process behind that, sir, and how does economics play into this particular game?
Okay. I'm not too sure economics plays in India's favor. It has happened in spite of economics. Let me
Sir.
explain. The fact that we got so many votes and the West got so little also points to the inconsistency of the West when it comes to global issues.
Hmm.
You have done Saddam, you have done in Iraq, you proceeded to do a Libya, you proceeded to do a Syria, and then you expect the people to say, yeah, look, this basically unbridled aggression going on, please join us. Then there is a certain degree of cynicism when it comes to those kind of calls, especially when you consider the fact that the West had promised that the NATO would not expand beyond a certain limit. You made agreements with the USSR, the erstwhile USSR, followed by Russia, regarding the limits of NATO expansion, and then you violated every one of them because, as George Bush said, we don't care, we won the Cold War.
Hmm.
Okay, after some time, you have a new kind of leadership, which, unlike Yeltsin, doesn't really give a damn, and it waited. It waited for the aggressive presidency of George Bush to be over. It waited for a time when the United States had overextended itself, and then it started to do the pushback. Let us face it, the Russians have done in Ukraine is cannot be supported, it's condemnable. But let us face it, what has happened in Ukraine? When the Ukrainians got a president who was pro-Russia, but he was elected through an election whose results cannot be disputed, you started a so-called orange revolution to basically turf him out. So in a sense, who has violated Ukrainian sovereignty? Russians certainly, but don't say the West has also not violated that particular
Yeah. Yeah.
sovereignty. So in this situation where nobody is sinless, for you to say, "Yar, support us vis-a-vis the Russians," is not likely to get that many calls. And let us face it, the global South was also afraid of offending the Russians. The Russians, in
Absolutely.
that sense, are forthright. So you would not want to offend the Russians either. So that counts for the lack of support that the West got. When it comes to India, look, India has always played at the margins. I mean, I think our years of grandstanding is over. But the things that we have raised over a period of time, and let me start, say, from the Doha round of the WTO. You
Mm.
know, the Doha round of the WTO, which so far was becoming a rich man's agenda or failing, finally became the development agenda because of the stance that India took vis-a-vis a number of issues, particularly public health. And ironically, in the Doha round, the country that supported us was Pakistan. You know, Murasoli Maran, along with one bureaucrat, he single-handedly threatened to bring the Doha round to a close until the minimum that India asked was agreed upon.
Agreed.
And
Mm.
ultimately, India got what it wanted. Okay. Unfortunately, we forget about the contribution of Murasoli Maran. His name should be written in golden letters. So after that, of course, Canton was a failure. But what we have done is basically raise those issues fairness in trade, public health, and so on and so forth, which the global south, which finds resonance in the global south. You don't find us, grandstanding. You don't find us following predatory trade practices. And there are certain things we have done. For example, this rupee trade, something which I'm extremely excited about. Look, a lot of African countries want to trade with India.
Mhm.
They could trade with India if they accepted Indian rupees.
Yeah.
Now, if they accept Indian rupees, what do you think they will do with this Indian rupees? They will buy Indian goods.
Mhm.
See, this rupee trade is also a very good way to boost domestic exports. And if you are able to do it, if it kicks on, great things. So what I'm trying to say is, if you look at India's development initiatives, our vaccine diplomacy, all this has led to a position or situation where India's call for support finds more traction than Western calls for support. And by the way, it has also happened at a time when we are the fifth largest economy in the world. So it's not
Mhm.
as if we don't have
Still time.
global
Hmm.
economic clout. We have economic clout, not that great an economic clout, but certainly more than the likes of England, etc., etc., whose ability, whose proclivity to appeal to its former colonies to come and vote alongside it does not cut ice any longer.
That's a very interesting answer that you've given, sir. But there's a follow up to this. You mentioned
Yeah,
Africa.
yeah,
Any particular reason that you've mentioned Africa? Because there is talks of rupee trade which is happening all over the world. I mean, there are loads of
absolutely,
countries which are talking about it. Why
absolutely.
did you pick up Africa in particular? Because right now we've had Minister Jaishankar coming back from Uganda, and there's obviously a lot of friction between the African nations and the Europeans, which was seen by these videos which are flying around the
Right,
place. Why
right.
did you take the example of Africa? That's very curious to me, sir.
You see, the question is the following. We are a large market.
Hmm.
India is a large market. But this is a dialogue we keep on telling the Europeans. This is a dialogue we keep on telling the Americans. But this is a dialogue we should also tell to the Africans. See, by the way, we buy oil from Angola. We buy a lot of minerals from Africa. But the question is, if there are other goods to be procured from Africa, let us open our things to them. We are a very powerful exporter to Kenya. Our exports to Uganda are also very, very high. But the same logic, if we are not to follow predatory trade, we should also allow these economies to export to India.
Yeah.
Now, our trade with Angola, in a sense, is not balanced because we buy oil from Africa, oil from Angola. We don't export much to it. Now the question is, if we want to balance this particular trade, our either their exporters have to be extra dynamic, or our exporters have to be extra dynamic. So far, we have not seen this dynamism. But when we push for rupee trade, we give a fillip to that particular trading impulse. So we tell the Africans, "You sell to our country, our rupees le jao. You do, we can pay in rupees. It's easy." So let them come over and try to see what they have. If they're already selling to us, they'll try to sell more.
More.
Paying in rupees should be much easier. And if you are taking rupees from us, देख लो हमारे देश से क्या खरीद सकते हो, and take it back. So Africa is an underexploited area. The Chinese have exploited Africa to the hilt, so much so that many African countries, in a sense, have started to resent this kind of presence. We've never done this. The voluntariness of our trade efforts, I think, is there for the world to see. So we start with a cleaner slate than either the Europeans or the Chinese.
How do you see the African countries coming to us for, helping them out in terms of balancing their deficit? This is an interesting development, and that's the reason why I picked up the Africa question, is
Look,
because there is a
we
lot which is happening there.
we cannot balance their deficit.
You can't. You
At
can't.
the end, each country, in a sense, has to basically step up to it
Exactly.
and balance. What we can do is ensure openness, access. Okay,
Sri Lanka.
I
Mm.
believe I believe we do give access. The rupee trade, in my opinion, makes it stronger.
Yes.
So you tell them, yeah, you want to export to them, yeah, export. Yeah,
Save your
rupees say
dollars.
no. Dollar. Absolutely.
Thank you for bringing that also, because a lot of people are speculating about it, and I think this particular dialogue will clarify a lot.
Look, it's like this. These are early days yet. A
Yeah,
lot
yeah, of
of
course.
people have said, we are not an export powerhouse. How can we have rupee trade? The rupee trade, in a sense, ensures that is one of the reasons that ensures, or the dollar trade ensures one of the reasons that the USA is such a large importer is because there is dollar trade.
Mm.
It is because no matter what the intrinsic value of the dollar is, I keep on accepting dollars. Okay. So with those dollars, I basically want to hold it on. It's a reserve currency. So that basically makes exporting to the United States a very attractive proposition. And that is why the United States keeps on printing dollars and basically gives it to the rest of the world.
Use it. Mm.
Hopefully, India won't do that. So the question is, since the rupee is no longer not necessarily not a reserve currency, people will use the rupee for something, and that is to buy. And if they use the rupee to buy Indian goods, then what happens is, because you're allowing rupee trade, your exports will also go up. This is a difference between our rupee trade and the dollar trade that exists today.
That's a smart thing, sir. I must say.
Uh,
I mean,
but
I hope we pull it off.
that could be wishful thinking. But
I hope we can pull it off.
yes,
So, you mentioned some stuff and the opportunities in front of India. Of course, we know that there are a lot of vested interests, and in the past some time, and allow me 30 seconds, in the past sometimes
yeah.
I've been able to distinguish these vested interests, which lay, of course, in the United States. There are two particular areas where the India interaction is the most. One, of course, is the State Department, and the second is the Defense Department. When we look at the Defense Department, it is India, 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 national security strategy, it's India, this, that, and the other. The detractors from this particular policy is obviously the State Department, where we know the neoconservatives, we know the vested interests of various different George Soros and so on and so forth. Uh, in this internal battle between the two departments within the US, this is not something new. I mean, I probably have stumped over it and I've probably been able to confirm it in my own mind recently. How do you see the vested interests within them fighting for and against India? And what kind of an impact do you see on India, considering the narrative attacks that have already come in, sir?
Look, I don't think that the narrative, the difference between the State Department and the Defense Department is as stark as it is being made out to be. I won't say that there is a deep state in the United States orchestrating like this, but let us face it, for a long period of time, the natural allies of the United States was Pakistan.
Mhm.
Okay. And significant elements of the United States establishment were comfortable with that. Now, that dynamic started to get over with the closure of the Cold War, and it got a further beating with what happened, 9/11 and so on and so forth. However, those twin departments were still very close to, far more comfortable with China than they were with India. So let's
Again.
not talk about Pakistan and India. Let's talk about our position vis-a-vis China and India. Now, what
Mm.
has happened? Somewhere down the line, the Americans have said, that the gambit we played with China, hoping that it would become a democratic state, we gave them so many concessions, allowed them into WTO, opened our markets for them. And here are the Chinese who, in a sense, basically are making life, in a sense, growing too big for their boots. So that's there. Yet within the United States itself, you have news agencies like Bloomberg, which basically keep on pushing the China story all the time and keep on running down India. Look, the fact remains that there are vast sections of the United States that are economically beholden to China, because they have a presence in the Chinese market. The strategic game that China plays, allow one or two players to have a presence in your market. It could be the media market, whatever, the financial market, so to speak. They will basically do their bidding for you. And these agencies, Bloomberg, they do follow a particular principle. You know, when you are bought, stay bought. So the Bloomberg faithfully and very strategically plays down India vis-a-vis the Chinese. So far, India did not have a coherent line, with respect to economics, with respect to a lot of things, you know, and as a result of which the United States kept on looking at India as a strange kind of a fish. We don't know what it is. India will still not allow the United States to use it as a gambit against China. Look, we have problems vis-a-vis China. How we solve them, ultimately, we have to solve it ourselves.
Mhm.
What we have to ensure is China does not receive support when we have a friction with China. It is not in China's interest, given its economic engagements, to have a war with India. Because let us face it, in a war with India or a conflict with India, India can inconvenience China tremendously. You know, and the Chinese growth model, which is based on exports, needs a peaceful world. It cannot function in a world where sea routes are disturbed or come under threat. Need I say more? So there is a limit to what China can do vis-a-vis India as of now. Later on, they will try newer things, they will try different things. But as of now, you can have a Galwan from time to time. You can have these inconvenient UN sessions, emergency sessions called by the Chinese from time to time, where the status of Kashmir Jammu Kashmir is discussed, and where to their shock they find even the Russians, in a sense, are not stepping up, because the Russians also know how far to go with China. The
Yeah.
Russians are mature enough to ensure that their friends won't decide who their enemies are. You see, that kind of maturity the Russians have. It seems that at times the Americans don't have this kind of maturity.
I agree with you absolutely. I don't think I have anything to add to that. That's a fantastic this thing. So my last
That is
two
the
questions.
problem.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think uh, what you've said is very, very interesting because the China challenge is, of course, a big challenge, and what we see coming out of America is the quest, and if I may use that word very carefully, the quest to get India into an alliance so that something could be done, or India could counter China in the region,
Very
and that's something
simple.
that we see.
They should have a trade policy where they should start sourcing stuff from India.
My question is, will there be a cost when we open out our markets and we say, okay, let's do this? What will be the cost that we will have to pay to the West apart from
See,
trade?
see, I don't see it as a cost. The fact is, if they shift some of their supply chains to India, then of course we start depending on Western markets. But they also start depending on the Indian market. No, nobody wants to disturb a set up supply chain.
Yeah,
So see, we have no problems with global integration. Okay, but the West is finding out that they are now beginning to have a problem with economic integration vis-a-vis the Chinese. They're beginning to find out, because the Chinese are beginning to flex muscles from time to time, send out very inconvenient reminders about what they can do. Okay? The Australians know about it. Slowly but surely, other countries who look at Australia are also starting to have second doubts. But even then, I do not see a concerted strategy by the West to ensure that they have an alternative supply chain in a country like India. And,
absolutely.
and I have to ask myself, why is that? Do they think that their problems with the Chinese are short-term problems that are going to go away? If so, we are all entitled to live, all entitled to our illusions. What can I say?
I mean, yeah, of course. It's also vested interest that you mentioned before. There's just so much of
Always,
integration which is
always,
there.
always, always.
There's just so much of it. So, my last question to you: for India to achieve what it wants to achieve, and the Prime Minister's laid it out very, very carefully. He said 2047, 25 years from now, we would like to call ourselves a developed nation. Now, there is a symbolic aspect to it because the Chinese say rejuvenation of China at 2049. That's 2 years after us. We say 2 years before them. What is the symbolism of something like that? And of course, on a more serious note, what are the biggest priorities that India needs to work on to achieve something like that? And I'd like to keep it economically, which will, of course, impact our geopolitical position.
Look, there's no symbolism. 2047 is 100 years after Indian independence. 2049 is 100 years of the takeover of the Chinese Communist Party. That's all. So that's the symbolism.
Yeah.
Look, to become a developed economy, what do you require? What is the sign of the developed economy? Is that everybody is educated, everybody is well fed, everybody has opportunities. And in today's environment, this has to be environmentally sustainable growth. Your model has to be one where there has to be sustainable all around, sustainability all around, social sustainability, environmental sustainability, and financial sustainability.
True.
And I would argue that we are on our way to do that. The Chinese probably are not. Look, I mean, why India, why China? Look, the Chinese started with a one-child policy. Okay, ruthlessly implemented it from 1949 onwards. Now what you have? The inversion of the pyramid. Inversion of the pyramid. Two people retiring, one person basically taking up. So
Yeah.
the pension burden on the working Chinese population, in a sense, is going to increase. The labor costs are going to increase. That will basically bring in some changes in the Chinese economy. I think some for the better, some will be painful. But when it comes to environmental sustainability, look, if you look at it, they are still depending on these mega projects, diversion of rivers, and so on and so forth. If you look at us, what we are looking at is not so much water linking. We talked about that some years ago. We are talking about rainwater harvesting. We are talking about, watershed management and so on and so forth. And that makes sense for us. Okay. We are talking about deforestation. We are talking about clean energy. Although we've told the rest of the world, we are not going to go along the timelines that you set. Already you see the elements of a social security net being put in. When it comes to health, we have a health insurance policy which receives far less praise than it actually should. We've already put up a digital infrastructure, and I'm talking about the JAM treaty, which will allow government to transfer incomes over a period of time. You will be able to implement a unique UBI, a unique basic income. The West will not be able to do because they don't have that digital infrastructure any longer. So
Connect.
I would argue with our policies, with our decentralized government, which has to have you have to give finances at appropriate levels, we will be able to do what we want to do in a manner that is politically sustainable, socially sustainable, environmentally sustainable. I doubt whether China has yet put in the kind of institutional bricks that are required to make this happen. I would argue we are putting in these particular bricks. And this is not just one government alone. Several governments, in a sense, have come together to make this happen. It's an India story. The tragedy is the following. The UPA government starts the UIDAI, and then certain jholawalas in that particular government says, "Oh, ye hona nahi chahiye." It is Prime Minister Modi who basically, invests a lot of capital and administrative power in ensuring that it is made complete. He invests political capital in ensuring that GST basically comes to fruition. Otherwise, before that, we were always dancing but never advancing. The head of the Congress of Vienna always danced but never advanced. He came in and within 2 years it was implemented.
Yeah.
There have been flaws, but nonetheless it's implemented. So the building blocks, in a sense, that were there all along, is being brought to position by investment of a lot of capital, a lot of effort by the present government. And that makes me, optimistic that we are on the right path. Macroeconomically policy, we have been following sound policies. Our banks have been cleaning up their acts. And if you look at the Chinese banks, that's another story out there. So if you look at Chinese finances, the manner in which so many things are hidden, we don't know what's going on out there. Although I believe the extent of which they're hiding things is possibly overstated. But when it comes to India, it's all easily available. You can see what's going on and you know what has to be done to put things right. And that is why I would argue We will become a developed country by 2047. Now, don't measure the development by, how many things will be earned per dollars, and compare us with the United States. The
Hmm.
United States and the Western European countries are for the first time seeing their middle classes falling into poverty.
Correct.
They have to go to food kitchens, charity to eat food. We did a lockdown. We were able to stave off starvation given our digital infrastructure, Food Corporation of India, and transfer of food gain and cash. The United States is still writing checks.
Yep.
The capacity in India now exists to do wonderful things. That capacity is something that the West never had, and the Chinese don't have either.
And they're not even talking about building it. If I
No,
may
not
just
at all.
go out.
Not at all.
This was eye opening, sir. Let me just say that. And as one thing just pops into the head when you describe things like that, it's called a basic backbone infrastructure, and that's not physical infrastructure. That is basically a developmental infrastructure which is coming up to support your people to do stuff
Yes,
on their own. And
on
that
their
to
own.
me was the difference between the package that was given in India during COVID and the package that was given in the US. They treated them is like children. Okay, here's your $10 pocket money. Go do what you want to.
And that is
We
why
said
they're in a
no.
massive mess today. You see,
Yes.
this splurging of money is one reason why they're in such a mess today. You see, if you look at our assumption of the G20 presidency, we've handled our COVID well.
Yep.
We've done it in a manner so that our macroeconomic factors are strong, inflation relatively low compared to the rest of the world, growth rates relatively high with respect to the rest of the world. These were the people who were telling us, keep on spending, etc.
Mhm.
When we were in a lockdown where spending wouldn't have done such a good. So today they are in a mess. And yet India does not get the kind of credit it should give, given the fact how well it's managed itself during COVID. So that shows what are the things that are going on in the rest of the world.
That's the ecosystem. So at the end of it,
That's it.
that's something that we know. Professor, this was an eye opener. Let me assure you this. Uh, it's a first interaction between you and me, and I look forward for many more, especially the one on China. I'm looking forward to that
For
because it's
sure.
going to be an eye opener for me personally because I am a China guy and I want to learn about the economics and how the economy of China is going to open out in some time. Coming back to this one, sir, I think you've brought about certain very interesting points with regards to India's growth that needs to be monitored by citizens. The reason I wanted to have this conversation is a lot of times people don't equate economics with geopolitics, and I'm a pure geopolitics channel. I thought there is a need for people to understand the economic standing of India, which is what is giving the heft to our leaders to do what they need to do in the world today. If Minister Jaishankar can speak the way he spoke in Europe and put them off, it is because of our economic standing, not just the chest beating thing that anybody would want to do. So thank you so much for bringing that out, sir. Please.
See, Jaishankar could say what he said because even in Europe there's divisions. I would imagine Prime Minister Meloni of Italy and possibly the Hungarians, okay, would not
Hmm.
take offense to what he said. So
Nope.
it's not a united Europe, actually. It's a quite a divided Europe, and those divisions we've played them pretty well. So he chose his audience well.
Absolutely. And Olaf Scholz also came out and said that, Europe's problems are not the world's problems. I mean, that was a shocker. The German chancellor. That's the big thing.
Germany hurts when you start freezing off Russia, cutting off Russia. Germans get hurt because they were the principal buyers of Russian gas and oil.
Sir, Europe has been in peace every time Germany and Russia have been friends. The time
See,
when there are tensions between Germany and Russia, things go to the dump, and they are going that way. And that's
they're
something
in a
that the
mess.
Europeans need to learn from their own history.
Right.
With the beautiful way that they've manipulated the world's history, they should at least learn this from the correct history of their own selves. So, as I said, thank you so much for this learning experience and a journey that we've had. Thank you so much, and look forward for having interactions with you in the future. Jai Hind.
Sure.